Well, welcome to the Leadership, Democracy, and National Security Lab of Arizona State University here in Washington. I am David Sheffer, professor of practice in the School of Politics and Global Studies, and I'm based in Washington with particularly my colleagues in the LDNS lab, many of whom are here in person or virtually today. I joined General Ben Freakley in heading up the national security component of the lab. General Freakley and I are shining a bright light on modern deterrence strategy in the face of a number of considerable variety of national security threats today. Deterrence strategy reaches far beyond military deterrence to include smart management of cyber assets, sanctions of economic, cultural, educational, and diplomatic character, lawfare, and the use of diplomatic clout within international and regional organizations, and tactful support of civil society to advance shared values. There is one other focused area of extreme importance to any strategist of deterrence: the multinational corporation. The power and influence of corporations in developing strategies that are developed, at least in part, to deter national security threats while still pursuing capitalist aims, have become increasingly vital to the foreign policy of the United States. Today, we have the expert about corporate foreign policy to address this subject and to serve as the inaugural speaker for this series on modern deterrence strategy. Kish Parella is the class of 1960 professor of ethics and law at Washington and Lee University School of Law. She is an international research fellow at the Oxford University Center for Corporate Reputation, Said Business School, Oxford University, and she also serves on the board of directors for Corporate Accountability Lab. Prior to entering the legal academy, she practiced international arbitration and transnational litigation at Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton. Her research focuses on the intersection between corporate governance and international law and explores how non-state actors encourage corporations and other business enterprises to comply with international law, including an examination of their incentives, methods, and effectiveness. And it's my great honor now to present to you Professor Parella, who is going to speak with you on corporate foreign policy. Professor?
Thank you so much, Ambassador Sheffer. So I'm so delighted to be here to talk about corporate foreign policy. And I think the first place to begin is to think about what it is and how it's different than a lot of other terms we've heard in the media and otherwise, such as ESG or corporate social responsibility or sustainability. And I certainly think corporate foreign policy has a lot in common with all of these concepts. But the way I use it really focuses on three characteristics. First, who is the audience for corporate foreign policy? I imagine that the primary audience for corporate foreign policy is primarily state actors. And this is a little different than corporate social responsibility or other forms of responsible business practices, because I think a lot of sort of corporate actions in that space speak to other audiences besides public actors, such as consumers, employees, and investors and various other constituents. In corporate foreign policy, all of those other stakeholders are certainly important in ways I'll talk about a little more later. But the primary audience for corporate foreign policy is probably is a state or an IGO, an intergovernmental organization. And the objective is a little different than corporate social responsibility. It's not really about just showing that corporations are quote unquote responsible in along some metric, but really about influencing the policy of one state towards another or on some other action on the world stage. And these aren't particularly new when it comes to corporate foreign policy. What I think is really interesting is that the mechanisms corporate foreign policy are distinct from corporate social responsibility and have started to crystallize in ways that mimic what we think of as national foreign policy. So let me give you an example. I think the closest parallels between corporate foreign policy and national foreign policy comes to things like declarations or statements issued by business leaders, prominently CEOs, the decisions to scale back or exit a country that sort of resembles private sanctions on a country by imposing some kind of cost on its economy. And three, of course, the provision of humanitarian assistance, either through monetary donations or donations of in-kind goods and services. And we certainly saw all three on display when we talk about the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So the target audience here, we could think of both foreign policy directed towards either Ukraine or Russia. In terms of objectives, deterring Russian attacks on Ukraine and aiding the Ukrainian civilian communities to basically, address the costs imposed by the invasion and thinking about assisting Ukraine in terms of aiding its defenses. The mechanisms, again, were three. One I don't have on the slide is talking about the numerous declarations issued by various CEOs and business leaders, either collectively or individually in response. The provision of humanitarian assistance that has been well documented across the media, and certainly the decision to leave Russia. And this has caused a lot of attention both among scholars and the media because of this idea of overcompliance. There was a massive exit from Russia in ways that are difficult to explain purely through a legal analysis. Certainly the US imposed significant sanctions on Russia, but in terms of the calculus as to whether businesses were going to leave, there seems to be a tenuous causal connection between the decision to leave for all these companies and the legal risk. So there was a lot going on, and part of what was going on is also the attention provided to companies that remained in Russia. But of course, not every single company acted the same. And I want to draw attention to what I think is one prominent example of tracking and monitoring of corporate foreign policy. So this is a slide that focuses on the Yale School of Management kept sort of a database of up to 1,000 companies across the world and their decisions on whether they were going to remain in Russia or not. And what's really important about this is that they were what we think of as an intermediary. They're a group that collected information that may or may not have been publicly available, but they brought it all together in one space and they classified the decisions of corporations according to 5 categories, ranging from full-out exit to what they called business as usual. And they went a step further in providing a form of evaluation, a grading scale from A to F. And it was interesting because this type of aggregation and comparability of corporate decisions makes it highly visible. You can imagine what can be done with this information. So, of course, the media was highlighting decisions of corporations based on this database. It's also very easy to share this information via Twitter. And this is one example of how different groups can collect this information and kind of shine a spotlight on the choices that corporations make following a crisis. And they're not the only ones. I mean, independently of the Yale School of Management, a number of different news sources also collected information on 2 decisions of companies, which is A, are they exiting or are they staying in Russia? And as well, what kind of humanitarian assistance are they providing to Ukraine? Now, most of my discussion is not about what policy a company should adopt. Instead, it's really looking at these decisions as an intersection of 2 sets of factors, which I classified as demand side factors and supply side factors. Now, demand side factors are somewhat helpful in thinking through why certain companies made the decisions they did. So, for example, not everyone exited Russia right away. Some companies stayed longer than others, and some are still there. So the question is why stay or leave? And it's tempting to ascribe different decisions to the fact that they're in different sectors, different nationalities. Certainly that's very important. But it's also interesting, there's a number of businesses that share a lot of common features. They all share the same nationality. They all sell the same kinds of goods. They adopted similar-ish business model, made very different decisions when it came to exiting Russia. The question is why? Because if we look at demand side factors, we only get half the picture. And what demand side factors are is really looking at who are the primary corporate stakeholders for a company and thinking about what are those preferences of those stakeholders when it comes to a particular issue. Now, this is a broad analysis that can be applied to whether we're talking about climate change or Russia's invasion of Ukraine or another issue. But demand side factors, I think, dominate so much of the conversation when we think about why companies do what they do. And it would focus on the preferences of significant stakeholders such as government actors, consumers, investors, employees, NGOs, and the media in terms of what is the sort of pressure to take one course of action versus the other. But that's only half the story, because there were companies that seem to have very similar profiles along demand side factors that did not act the same. So the question is why? So what I was interested in are supply side factors. Now, I don't mean to suggest that this is an exhaustive set of causal factors explaining why some companies did what they did, but I disclose that it comes from my unique perspective as someone who teaches, researches, and practices international business transactions. And we can imagine there are a number of IBT factors that can constrain the ability of a corporation to follow its chosen corporate foreign policy. And I identify a few here. Business model, which is how is a company doing business in Russia, China, India? You pick your country. That has ramifications for whether a company can exit and how. Evaluating contract design, perhaps it's because I'm a contracts professor and I spend a lot of time thinking about contract design, but what does the contract provide for? Who has decision-making authority when it comes to decisions like whether you're going to close your store, whether you're going to shut down the store completely and exit? In a previous life, I practiced international investment law. This also becomes significant because international investment law, as a body of international law, can provide coverage for losses sustained when a corporation takes actions that a government does not like. So, for example, when companies were threatening to exit Russia, the Russian government also threatened to externally manage it, exiting firms that had over 25% of foreign control. And so the question is, how can companies pursue their policy to exit Russia if they're going to sustain significant losses? Some of those may be protected through international investment law and guarantees there, or not. So that's one possibility. The other is political risk insurance. To what extent can political risk insurance also cover some of the decisions a company may want to make? Both of these could be available to embolden companies to take decisions in a moment of crisis. It's a little challenging with Russia that I'm happy to talk about a little later, but in theory, they're out there as pillars that may facilitate or inhibit a company to act on the world stage. And what's very interesting about this is some of it is within a company's ability to control, and some of it's not. Like international investment law is, I would say, on the spectrum, more outside its ability to control than not as a form of international law, but it's still part of the landscape of what can constrain a company or not. The other two factors have more to do with the provision of humanitarian assistance than exit, which is organizational structure. To what extent is a corporation really set up to provide meaningful aid in the face of a crisis, whether it's an armed conflict or whether it's a natural disaster or something else. And fostering strategic partnerships is also important when we ask ourselves, is a corporation really well placed to be of help in a moment of crisis? So I'm going to go into at least a couple of these in greater detail. So business model. Business model became very interesting when it came to questions of some companies exiting while others didn't. And of course, when you see your peer companies leaving and making statements, and there's one company that doesn't exit, that gets a lot of attention from the media and, more importantly, social media. And a lot of these decisions were publicized quite widely on social media. And there have been quite a few interesting empirical studies as to the effect of threatened boycotts on social media influencing the decisions of companies to exit Russia. But even if a company wants to exit, there are differences based on what business model you chose. So, for example, if a company entered the Russian market by owning its stores directly, it has the ability to, close or suspend sales in those stores, or to close them in ways that can be more difficult if they adopted a certain type of other business model, such as a franchise model or a master franchise agreement, in which the decision to make termination decisions or suspension decisions is allocated to a different party. So the business model one chooses is really important. And this is interesting because when we think of international business transactions, and when a corporate executive may evaluate what business model to choose to enter a foreign market, there's a list of obviously pros and cons. And that list may not have included things like corporate foreign policy. It may have included things like minimizing cost, minimizing risk. But the example of Russia demonstrates how important it is to think as one factor. To what extent does this business model give the corporation control over decisions regarding termination, suspension, and exit, should it choose to do so? Because one thing that is clear is that when it comes to providing goods and services, many corporations use what's called a disaggregated model, right? Whether we're talking about outsourcing or franchising or various other things, we're talking about doing things through contract where we have a lot of parties included. And that can have a lot of great benefits, but a disaggregated model might not give a lot of decision-making control. And that becomes tricky because if representatives from your various stores or branches start making decisions independently of headquarters, there's a question of attribution. And so who is going to be basically associated with those decisions of all these offices all over the world? And I think that's what we saw following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is if there is a particular business partner or particular stores that are open, the broader brand is going to be associated with that action. And that's a choice of business models. So it's worth investigating whether the preferred business model still makes sense if corporate foreign policy is a factor that's important. A second issue is even if you want to keep the same business model, it's time to reevaluate contract design. And I won't bore you with the details here, but it's worth thinking about what are the issues over, what are the issues regarding reputation, speaking for the company? Are we evaluating suspension or exit, even material breach and termination? What is allowed within that contract? How much control does one party have in that contract regarding various issues that a crisis may raise? And of course, I talked a little bit about loss absorption. And I'm not going to go over it again, but basically there are two other ways to absorb some of the costs that might be associated with a particular choice of corporate foreign policy, specifically exit. So how can corporate foreign policy facilitate U.S. foreign policy objectives? So one is supplementing humanitarian assistance. We could think about this in terms of monetary donations, in-kind donations, or core competencies collaboration. So there are three different choices. And one thing that I found a little disappointing is that intermediaries were comparing companies regarding decisions of exit, whereas I did not see the same kind of systematic analysis of companies regarding humanitarian assistance. Some media outlets did cover it, and a lot of Googling did it, but there were three choices. Either you make a monetary donation, you make an in-kind donation, basically offering goods and services free of charge, or what I think is interesting is core competencies collaborations, which is a company thinks about what is it that you do really, really well, and how can you serve in a situation of crisis using that function, which is often what is happening when we think about private sector collaborations. What is your core competence? And what's interesting is some of the corporations that made headlines are ones that had learned from past crises about what their core competencies are and what the drawbacks of their competencies are, and had forged strategic partnerships with either government agencies or NGOs to basically compensate for what might be a weakness. Promoting human rights and the rule of law. Another way is, how does a company adhere to international standards of responsible behavior that has been well recognized? The UNGPs is a common language of thinking about how corporations should respect human rights throughout their operations. It's certainly, I think, a bedrock of a lot of initiatives that are coming out of Europe and even discussed in the US and implemented in the US. So to what extent is that driving the decisions of corporations? Earlier during the reception, we talked about authenticity. A lot of corporations claim to follow the UNGPs or the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but to what extent are these claims authentic and true? Anyone can make a statement or issue a report. The question is, how deeply does it inform the critical decision-making of a company in moments that matter? And the other thing is the global leadership. I have that as one example, which is, Microsoft's CEO has been advocating several years ago now for the idea of a digital Geneva Convention. But there are other examples of other companies thinking about situations where global coordination would be helpful in identifying gaps in the regulatory framework. What's not helpful? Well, human rights abuses. If a corporation claims to care about human rights and the rule of law and then specifically does not adhere to those principles, that is not helping them or U.S. foreign policy. Private economic sanctions. I think one thing that was interesting following the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that, as I said, many companies exited or threatened to exit or certainly scale back their operations. And this is part of a broader conversation about this phenomenon called overcompliance. And there are lots of reasons companies might do this. It's a complex regulatory framework. They may not know what sanctions are coming down the road. It might be unclear what is or is not allowed. So maybe exit is a logical option. But what it means is that the scale of exit is magnified by a second round of private sanctions that follow state-based sanctions. And that kind of raises questions about how precise sanctions will be, because there is this kind of wave of private sanctions. Here, I just put this on the table as one thing to think, maybe not so much about Russia, but going forward, in-kind assistance. The question is, to what extent is the provision of humanitarian assistance or other assistance by a corporate actor raising questions of attribution or other types of complexity with state-based foreign policy? One thing I wanted to highlight is that it's very difficult to understand why companies do what they do. I just want to identify factors that might be relevant. And one thing that's worth talking about is that the corporate practice of foreign policy is only one dimension of the privatization of foreign policy. There's something else going on here too, which is the incentives for companies to practice that policy. And this is a framework that obviously is taken from stakeholder management theory and has been, dominating thinking in that space for decades. And I borrow it for this project and others because this identifies non-state actors who influence the actions of corporations. This is a very simplistic model, but I put it on there to identify some of those who I pay attention to, such as investors, employees, consumers, financial institutions, NGOs, insurers, benchmarking organizations, industry organizations. So most of my work focuses on when, how, and what human rights corporations commit to and comply with. And all of these actors are really relevant to that conversation. But they could also be relevant to questions about what corporate foreign policy a company actually adopts and how successfully they manage it. And you'll notice that the state actor is only one of these actors. Sure, there are so many others. So when we think about who is influencing particular types of corporate foreign policy, the state is only one among several, potentially. And here's a slide from a different paper, again, focusing on human rights, but I just want to identify the actor, as I said, were all those different circles of who might be playing a role, but it's important to identify the mechanism and the incentive. So what gives them a seat at the table? Well, they use different mechanisms to influence corporate action, such as, one thing I've been paying attention to with, benchmarking organizations, they use industry rankings, issue rankings, which is, again, it's about information. It's about aggregating, verifying to the extent they verify, and categorizing information in one space regarding what companies are doing. And that really kind of lowers the cost for monitoring of companies by the public. And that kind of information is then used by other types of non-state actors, such as investors or NGOs, or maybe even the media, to draw public attention to what a company is doing, especially if it's underperforming its peers. And the incentives that shape the corporate decisions are obviously not just about legal risk, but about various other types of carrots and sticks, such as reputational costs or reputational benefits, risk management, market pressure, and so forth. So just to give a sort of a more complex picture of what privatized foreign policy really looks like. So this, I can skip this because this is just sort of more about my research agenda. But I think we want to really focus on what are the key takeaways for both private sector and policymakers. I think it's important to think about planning ahead and really focusing on, in the moment of crisis, what we want to do. These two are, it's a pair of papers, International Law in the Boardroom and Corporate Foreign Policy and War, really walks through, in the first paper, how international law influences board governance and executive decision-making, or CAN. And Corporate Foreign Policy and War really talks about how the decisions, like a bottom-up view of all these independent actions by corporations that can have an aggregate effect regarding what they're doing on the world stage and how it intersects with others. And I think with that, I'm going to stop. And I'm happy to answer more in Q&A.
Thanks very much. I certainly regard this as sort of cutting edge. Sorry about that. I certainly consider this to be at the cutting edge of so much of how we react to foreign crises these days. Corporations can oftentimes have far more impact than governments, than military organizations, at least in the beginning, because corporations can act very, very quickly. And because of that, they're under considerable pressure to exercise what Professor Parella has described essentially as foreign policy decision-making. If you can imagine yourself in a boardroom, and you hear of a certain set of actions by the government, a certain set of sanctions being imposed by the government, even by executive order, very, very quickly, and you have to respond to that. But I can imagine that so many of those discussions then leap beyond that to, wait a minute, we can comply at a minimum level with the government sanctions, but what does our reputation require here? What does our consumer base require in terms of sustaining our credibility in the marketplace in the face of such a catastrophic event such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine? So, Professor Parella, I want to start, if I may. I'm going to ask some questions, and then we'll see if we've got some from the audience and from our virtual audience. How does your thesis about corporate foreign policy intersect with the traditional corporate social responsibility theory and practice of the last few decades? And I ask that question because so many of those who are listening and so many of us in the academic teaching field are extremely familiar now with corporate social responsibility, which very much it keys off of the guiding principles on business and human rights of the United Nations and of the responsibility of corporations to recognize and protect human rights. But corporate foreign policy is a different animal. And can you explain the distinction between those two?
Sure. I think that if I were talking to an executive, one thing that I would focus on is that the mechanisms of corporate foreign policy seem to have a narrower toolkit, whereas a lot of things are presented as corporate social responsibility. And I don't think that's the same as corporate foreign policy. I think when it comes to humanitarian assistance, there's where you see the greatest overlap. But again, with corporate foreign policy, there's a unique objective that is served because there's a crisis. So it's by its very nature, it's being deployed in a situation of crisis. And that's one component. And there's an objective when you're providing aid in a crisis. What are you doing? So I think that is one thing that is unique about it. And I said before, the other two factors are who's your primary audience? I mean, consumers are watching, employees are watching, and various other actors are watching, but you're usually doing it to a primary audience that's very much public. And you're doing with the objective is in terms of aid is delivering on some set of core priorities that may be shared with other actors that are not corporations, such as governments or NGOs and various other things.
Do you think there's a prospect in the future, Kish, of developing any particular guidelines for corporations in the execution of their foreign policy as opposed to their compliance with minimum standards of human rights protection?
I think there will be a significant need for that because, one issue, of course, is the incentives that lead companies to adopt one corporate foreign policy or another may conflict with the objectives of an aid organization. For example, we talk about what's the best thing for a corporation to do. Should it provide in-kind goods and services or a monetary donation? That obviously varies based on the company and the crisis, but we can imagine that one set of incentives, if it's driven by reputation and reputational benefits, the research suggests that in-kind donations of goods and services may garner greater reputational benefits for a corporation than a monetary donation. But that might not be the best thing for that corporation to do in a crisis. And so we can envision there could be corporate incentives may not lead to the best value added. So it would be good to think about what would be a framework of thinking of how to make these decisions beyond simply corporate interest.
So let's enter the battlefield.
Uh-oh.
A privatized foreign policy,
Mm-hmm.
how can that serve as a deterrence to illegal conduct by a nation? Classic example, Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
So part of what I think a number of CEOs presented their actions as is recognizing the unlawfulness of what Russia did. And through all three actions kind of making a statement and acting on that statement, taking a stand on that. There's another deterrent action, which is not focusing on states, but corporations, which is, as I said, there are two dimensions of privatization when it comes to foreign policy. One is corporate foreign policy, but the second is also all those non-state actors who potentially nudge corporations to follow international law. And here, I think that is a really important dimension of deterrent policy, because stakeholders can introduce or suggest or incentivize structural change in a company that might be more challenging using other mechanisms. So, for example, let's talk about the UNGPs, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. A number of stakeholders have requested or asked questions about how deeply the UNGPs are embedded within companies. And that's part of the deterrent conversation, because, by embedding these international guidelines into board oversight, supply chain contracts, risk management, a company is operating in a way more consistent with international law, which not only makes it a good part of the international legal order to encourage international law compliance, but also hopefully ensures that that company itself is not violating international law.
Now, there are relatively new national security threats, which include rising levels of cyber attacks, climate change, migration, nuclear proliferation, as we've never seen it before, pandemics, aggressive cross-border wars, atrocity crimes, food insecurity, starvation, natural calamities. One might think the world's coming to an end. How, in general, should corporations react to these existential issues in their operations, business planning, and their role in society as a whole? I ask that question because governments are not going to try to direct corporations in general to respond to all of these existential threats.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they pose national security threats in all of their dimensions. So it really leaves it to the corporation to be imaginative and innovative in how they see their responsibility to respond to these threats, which will go to the core of national security.
Well, I think, it is really important that corporations look at these issues. And I think what's happening is there's been a lot of pressure on corporate actors to pay attention to issues in a very siloed fashion, whether it's climate change or it's geopolitical risk or so forth. And I think what's hopefully going to happen is the corporations are incentivized to look at it more in a holistic way. And I think three things are primarily very important. One is evaluating the likelihood that one or more business operations is going to be impacted by, let's say, high-level crises of the nature that you identified. After a likelihood analysis, then to focus on two things. What is your corporate foreign policy? Because companies do have one, whether they realize it or not. Especially with information, it's going to become, I imagine, easier to track how corporations respond to a global crisis, and potentially to compare their reactions across crises. So the question is, what is your corporate foreign policy? And when you're crafting one, I again urge companies to think about the value of international law in answering some of these questions. I think international law is particularly useful for two things. What should we do? Sort of normative guidance as to what are the core values or the core norms that we want to be guided by, as well as operational guidance as to how to do it. So again, the United Nations Guiding Principles and other guidance that has come out from the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights and various other international organizations provides fairly in-depth guidance on due diligence, board governance, and various other corporate functions that can benefit from sort of incorporating international law norms in order to respond to a crisis. And then the final thing is, once you know what your corporate foreign policy is, to think about whether the way you operate your business is set up that you can make good on that corporate foreign policy, which is the whole point of the presentation that I gave, which is really thinking about supply side factors. It's not enough to have a human rights policy or even a corporate foreign policy. It's to really think about whether the broader set of business operations and the enterprise is set up to execute it, which means other types of decisions a company may make 5-10 years earlier that has to do with a whole different set of interests may come back to constrain the company when it's time to act.
We have a couple of questions from the virtual audience. I'm going to modify one just for clarity. What can a corporation do if their foreign policy or actions alternate or conflict
Right.
with a group of its audience, which I think might mean its customers?
Okay. I think that's just the reality for a number of different types of global issues. So, for example, for a number of companies, their consumer base is global. And so there could be a difference of opinion as to what is the corporate foreign policy based on a divided consumer base. And I think this is something that has been studied regarding China, frankly, and China's stance on various issues. And so part of what a company should do is to think about its own core values and to have a justification for what its policy is that guides it crisis to crisis. And I think that would provide a company with an overall set of values that explains how it responds across the world, frankly. And again, international law would be quite helpful in thinking about how it crafts its policy to any particular crisis.
I have a second one from our virtual audience. How seriously should a corporation take social media when designing its foreign policy?
I think corporations should be aware that social media can transmit information fairly rapidly. That's that. And that I think after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, social media also proved that, lots of action or inaction can be magnified and get news attention. Beyond that, I think a corporation should then be incentivized to take a proactive stance, at least thinking about what their policy would be if asked. The attention of social media just draws attention to the fact that these questions are going to be posed to corporate leaders. And so it's good to think ahead and plan ahead as to how one is going to respond.
Do we have any questions from, yes, Mike?
If I characterize it correctly, and that is, what if I'm using the case of AI, where the industry is telling the world political actors, regulate us, give us an environment in which we can find ourselves, as this rapidly accelerating technology has both positive and seriously potential negative effects. How does corporate foreign policy influence governments to go ahead and give them what normally they might resist or have problems with, this now going in the other direction? Give us a state actor foreign policy framework in which we can find our corporate foreign policy reflected.
I think that AI is one example of a broader need. I mean, I think that it's a great question, because it really opens up this issue of, is corporate foreign policy easier or more difficult in the absence of state foreign policy on a particular issue? And while different corporate leaders may disagree, I do think that, at least in the human rights space, a number of corporations have been very vocal about how clear international guidelines could be very helpful to set a floor for all competitors globally regarding what they should do. So I think corporate foreign policy, from the need for coordination between national foreign policy and corporate foreign policy, as well as how easily a corporate actor can act on its policy, may benefit from transnational coordination as to what set of expectations we have for industry.
May I follow up
Yeah,
with one
sure.
thing on that? Is
Please.
because thank you very much for that. As a diplomat for many years, one of the main complaints I was always confronted with by our American corporations
Yeah.
on the foreign policy side was in relation, for instance, to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that American companies were forced to comply with its provisions, whereas foreign companies did not feel equally constrained, and therefore the American companies found themselves at a competitive disadvantage. How do you square that circle?
You know, I think today there are two types of regulatory factors. You know, one is public regulation, and the other, which is far more messy, and it's obviously not the same, but there's private governance as well. There's factors that lead companies to do X, Y, and Z. And I think that that changes the calculus as to whether public regulation is the preferred choice, because the expectations are clear with public regulation, and it would set sort of more of a level playing field for companies within industry. So private governance is the alternative. I also think that some companies may desire a level playing field across multiple jurisdictions, because if some jurisdictions are going to regulate in a certain area, that might have sort of global regulatory effect. So it might be good to have an open conversation about what transnational regulation would look like.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you.
I want to go back to one of the most fundamental points I think you're making, and just ask you to amplify it. You've, in your writings and in your remarks today, you contrast between the targeted sanctions that a government imposes on corporations in response to a foreign policy crisis versus the comprehensive sanctions, which, as I understand it, is sort of the combination of both the government imposed sanctions plus the privatized sanctions that the corporations themselves then generate in response to the crisis. And the US government's intent to targeted sanctions against Russia and even China can be overwhelmed by the comprehensive nature of the corporate action that will affect consumers at large. In other words, there's that contrast between, I understand what the US government is saying in this crisis. It wants a specific set of sanctions imposed, but then corporations are making their own decisions that have as a floor the government sanctions, but might have much more going on, including exit from the country. Can you, I just want you to amplify that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, it just raises the possibility that, you know, government imposed sanctions may be the first step, but there could be a second wave of corporate sanctions that have to do with sort of scaling back their operations in a particular jurisdiction. And that has to do with regulatory complexity. It could also have a lot to do with, you know, some of the stakeholder interests that we were talking about. It just raises questions about, you know, to what extent is there going to be a magnifier effect for sanctions going forward? And that's worth thinking about, because then if there is sort of a second wave of sanctions imposed by corporations, independent of what state-based sanctions are, that I imagine would be a factor in thinking about sanctions policy.
You know, it's interesting. We so often think of civil society and human rights organizations as having to push governments and then push corporations. But in some respect, corporations can sort of take the lead here. They can sort of they can have the advantage in the debate by responding to the crisis with the more comprehensive privatized approach, not necessarily waiting for civil society to pressure them to do so, but rather it being a growing natural phenomenon that when there's a foreign crisis, again, you can take Ukraine as one of them, where corporations are not waiting for civil society to pressure them to go beyond where the government has set the sanctions, fence. Did you see that sort of evolve in not only the Ukrainian situation, but perhaps others where corporations were not necessarily waiting for the pressure from civil society?
I think the pressure from civil society may have had a longer history that allowed some corporations to be in a position where they can respond. So, which is why when we think about the ability of a corporation to respond to a crisis is really a product of all the decisions they made prior to that crisis. So I can imagine if a company, for example, is providing in-kind goods and services, that is probably the result of earlier engagement by civil society in other crises that predated the one at issue. And so it's a long history of back and forth with these companies, whether we're talking about shareholders pressuring companies to adopt human rights due diligence in their practices, whether we're talking about NGOs or other organizations that collaborated with companies to provide humanitarian assistance in past crises. I think companies respond to that and adopt it within their operations, whether we're talking about capacity building, whether we're talking about policy development. These sorts of this kind of history between civil society and corporate actors may then lead them to be in a position where the corporation has sufficiently developed the ability to respond to a crisis the way they do in that moment, maybe not at the behest of civil society, but because of a past history.
And I want to go back to one point that you were really stressing, Kish, which is the humanitarian assistance side of this equation for corporations. You pointed out a very interesting dilemma for corporations, which is, do we provide goods and assistance, in-kind assistance, tangible assistance to those victims who are desperately in need of the tangible assistance? Or do we as a corporation decide in the boardroom, let's just make a financial contribution to ICRC or Médecins Sans Frontières, and we'll send out a press release saying we're doing so, and then we'll just get back to our normal business of selling our product globally. I think that's a fascinating dilemma for directors sitting at that boardroom to decide. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
I think there are a couple of things that corporate executives should pay attention to. What kinds of corporations should be thinking about humanitarian assistance? I think it would be particularly important for those who operate in who have business lines that relate to necessities in a crisis. And we can think of that as, food, water, shelter, clothing, medicine, whether that crisis is armed conflict or whether that crisis is a natural disaster or something else, that these are provisions that are going to be in demand. And so I think the spotlight will be on those corporations. The question about whether it is a monetary donation or in kind is a good one. And it depends on a variety of factors one can imagine. But as I highlighted earlier, here's where the incentives may be off between corporate decision-making and what we can think of as maybe public focused decision-making. Perhaps the best thing to do is to make a monetary donation. But again, if the incentives are led by reputational benefits, that could lead to a very different outcome, which is donation of in-kind goods and services. And sometimes that might be the right course of action. And sometimes perhaps not. But I think it's important that set of decisions is informed by considerations other than what's going to get us the most positive reputational benefit. This is where strategic partnerships come in. To what extent can a company really think through, are we in a position to really make a meaningful contribution in kind goods and services? What are our core competencies, and to what extent have we identified strategic partners who can work with us to respond to a crisis in a way that is helpful? The other thing that I think is important is I hope that corporate executives think about humanitarian assistance, because it would be interesting if an intermediary started to track humanitarian assistance responses to various global crises, whether it's an earthquake or a flood or whatever, because so many of these responses are now being tracked by the media or through various databases. And that would be another dimension of corporate responses to a crisis that could be amplified across the media. So it's just something to think about.
So I'd like to conclude with sort of the mega question, which is, can we safely assume that within the last few years in particular, that corporations in the conduct of their, multinational operations, but let's center the question on U.S. corporations, that there's an increased level of decision-making that does have a bearing on how the United States is deterring threats to its national security, because corporations are responding to that, particularly in AI and in other fields where the threat to our national security is becoming so prominent in so many different ways that corporations are responding to that with their own initiative. Can we conclude that at this point?
I think that we can certainly observe that corporations are under pressure to respond to a series of crises. And the way they respond to those crises is going to have implications both for them and for those not related to the corporation. And so there are important conversations about the intersection between national foreign policy and corporate foreign policy. And to the extent that the latter amplifies the effectiveness of the former, or potentially may be in conflict.
All right, thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone who attended and joined us in this discussion. And we'll continue this with further such addresses in the spring of 2024. So thank you all very much on behalf of ASU and the LDNS Lab. Thank you.